Most people would believe that's your best film. Do you believe that?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, to me...
Is it your favorite?
I like it, but all the films I make, I really don't go and revisit them.
This may just be the best era in Martin Scorsese's cinematic career, which off the rip I know is crazy because he's made films like Mean Streets and Taxi Driver and Raging Bull and Goodfellas and The Departed. Or it may not be. I don't know. You see, he's done so much and evolved so much, and his style has changed over the years in so many ways. But by the end of this video, trust me, you'll see exactly why, and more importantly, how Scorsese has gotten even better with age. I mean, he made The Wolf of Wall Street in his 70s. Like, that shit is crazy. But before I get to that film, let's go back a few decades to talk about each era of his filmmaking, or what I perceive to be each era of his filmmaking, and see how his style has evolved and become stronger and stronger as the years have gone on. The 1970s was a perfect time for Scorsese to start making films. Some of his best-known work came out between 1970 and 1980, films like Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, and Raging Bull. But hold on to that for a second, because I am going to get into why those films are so special. But I believe his first era of filmmaking started a few years before that. You see, in the late 60s and early 70s, the film industry changed drastically due to the collapse of the studio system. And in that time, the young, fresh out of film school, independent filmmakers were starting to take over. We're talking names like Lucas and Spielberg and De Palma and Coppola and Bogdanovich. And Scorsese was right in the middle of that with his raw, gritty realism focusing on urban life and personal turmoil.
All right, okay. Thanks a lot, Lord. Thanks a lot for opening my eyes.
Wait. That's his second era. We're going to get to that. But his first era, like I said, started a few years before this, with his first two films, Who's That Knocking at My Door and Boxcar Bertha. Now, the reason I call this his first era is because he was really trying to find his voice with these two films. With Who's That Knocking at My Door, we see Scorsese wearing his influences on his sleeve, specifically the influences of the French New Wave and Italian neorealism. But even in that, you can still see elements of his style that is to come, particularly with his use of music. And his next film, Boxcar Bertha, doesn't really feel like a Scorsese film at all. He made it for producer Roger Corman, who at the time was known as the king of exploitation films. And many critics have remarked that the film felt less like a director finding his own personal vision and more like an exercise in execution for him.
There is a story about you and Cassavetes after Boxcar Bertha.
Right. He took me to his office and he looked at me. He said, "Hey, career," and he grabbed me and he embraced me, and then he pulled me aside. He said, "You just spent a year of your life making a piece of junk. You could do better than that," he said. "You can't get stuck. I know you like B movies. I know you like the old movies coming out of Hollywood, but you do different things." And in a sense, there I realized, maybe he's right. The reality is I'm not a Hollywood director, the ones I wanted to be. But what I did have in mind was to combine what I knew, which was really a kind of a combination of a certain kind of reality with the actors that I saw Cassavetes and Kazan have, and mix that with the tradition of a Ford or an Orson Welles with the use of camera.
And he did just that. Okay, now we can play the shot. This is the beginning of his second era of filmmaking, which happened between 1973 and 1980. Mean Street captured the essence of New York's Little Italy, exploring themes of sin and redemption. He basically took everything that he was doing in Who's That Knocking on My Door and improved it, making his own voice more clear in the process. He was beginning to create his own visual language. But wait, I know I said we could play the shot, but I kind of want you to hold on to it for a second, because another shot exactly like this pops up in a film in the 90s, and I want you to compare the two to see how he improved on this technique 20 years later. If you can guess the film in the shot that I'm talking about, make sure you leave a comment below and let me know what you think. But what Mean Streets also did was introduced us to Martin Scorsese's main pillars of storytelling, which essentially means what most of his films are about, and that's crime, religion, consequences, and redemption. Sometimes it's one of these, sometimes it's a combination of these, but these themes seem to come up in almost all of his films. And you can particularly see it in his 1976 film, Taxi Driver. Taxi Driver is a deep dive into urban alienation with Scorsese's distinctive kinetic style evident in his vivid portrayal of New York City at night. Mean Streets solidified the interest in the type of stories that Scorsese would go on to tell, but Taxi Driver solidified the visual storytelling that Scorsese would become known for. You still see the influences that shaped his cinematic taste, but now he's taking them and making them his own. For instance, this shot. It happens after Travis takes Betsy on a terrible date. Travis calls her and he tries to get her back, but it's not going too well. And then, as if the camera can't stand to watch this embarrassing moment any longer, it moves away from Travis.
Well, okay. Can I call you again?
It's so embarrassed for him it can't even watch on. You see, visual language and visual literacy is just as legit as the spoken word or the written word. You can say so much with what you do with the camera, and Scorsese was starting to develop this into his work in Taxi Driver. Beyond that, you can see his style of editing starting to develop even further.
Editing is Marty's favorite part of filmmaking, and so he participates extremely in the editing, as he does in the design of the camera work, too. So it's just, it's just the way we work. He tells me what he wants, and I try and achieve that, just as he does with the cameraman. A lot of people think editing should be invisible, but we've never felt that way. We always like to slap the audience in the face if it's required. It's not always. Sometimes you do want it to be invisible. You want a dialogue scene just to flow.
Sometimes a well-placed attention-grabbing edit can assist in the storytelling. The 1970s was a place of exploration and self-discovery for Scorsese. He admits that he didn't really know what direction to go after Taxi Driver, which is where you get films like New York, New York. But it was also a time of personal turmoil in Scorsese's life, which is well documented, so I won't really get into it. But all of that turmoil almost caused Scorsese to quit filmmaking altogether. But fortunately, thanks to Robert De Niro, he didn't, and we got this masterpiece. Which I feel is the last of his great early works and the end of his second era of filmmaking. This film was Scorsese taking everything that he had learned, everything that he had tried, all of his artistic talent, and combining it into one fantastic work. But going even further than that, he took the sounds of the film to also aid in telling the story. For instance, in The Ring, Scorsese uses animal sounds to heighten the experience of the fights. However, as the film goes on, you also hear those sounds in Jake LaMotta's life. What Scorsese is doing here is blurring the lines between real life and life in the ring, showing the violence in the ring spilling out into Jake LaMotta's actual reality.
So atmosphere is very important. That includes sound, huh?
Now, Raging Bull was a triumph in every single way, except financially. And unfortunately, Heaven's Gate, which was also produced by United Artists along with Raging Bull, happened to release on the same day.
The 70s studio system changed a great deal, and the week that film was released was the same week from the same studio that Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate opened. That, Raging Bull, Apocalypse Now, all from the same studio, United Artists. That ended what the 70s, they call this, golden age, that sort of. But really, it ended the power of the director.
Now, Heaven's Gate is known as one of the biggest financial flops ever and bankrupted United Artists altogether, which essentially ended the young independent filmmaker movement of the 70s, taking away the freedom that these young filmmakers had and putting it back in the hands of the studios and the corporations. And like every filmmaker from that era not named Lucas or Spielberg, Scorsese had to change the way he made movies. Hell, even Spielberg had to change the way he made movies because he was going over budget too much. Which brings us to Scorsese's pseudo-commercial era of the 1980s. Grandiose storytelling combined with heightened cinematic techniques. And the reason I say pseudo-commercial era is because, as we'll see later on, Scorsese has an actual commercial era, which we'll get to. Let's wait for it. This era was Scorsese not only showing Hollywood that he could make movies that made money, but that he could finish them on time and under budget.
Somehow we wound up with Color of Money, and that, once again, was a learning experience and a workout, so to speak. Again, 50 days, maybe 55 days, I think, shooting. I think we came in a day under. We came in $1 million under. In other words, I was
the word got around that it's okay, you could let him in the room again.
Films like The Color of Money, where you could still see Scorsese's style, but more like a light version of it. It's not that The Color of Money is bad, it's actually pretty good, but it feels like a director is making a film and trying to say, let's put a little bit of Scorsese into this, rather than Scorsese making a film that is unique to his own filmography. It's a sanitized, commercialized version of Scorsese's style, but it worked. The film made money. But you could see the direction where he was going in the 1980s with the two films that came out before The Color of Money.
King of Comedy, very, very tough picture to make for me. And for the whole year of '83, I worked on Last Temptation. We were flying around the world, getting costumes, locations, casting, everything else. And then that was canceled 4 weeks before the end of the year.
The King of Comedy is looked at as a cult classic now, but when it came out, it was considered a big flop and a huge disappointment, not to mention it was critically panned.
King of Comedy was listed by the end of the year, on New Year's Eve. I remember on Entertainment Tonight, I happened to have it on, and I was putting on a tie to go to a dinner for New Year's Eve, and they said, and now the flop of the year. And
King of Comedy?
And the curtain opened, and there was King of Comedy.
He bounced back with a modest financial hit with After Hours.
I was at a very interesting point in my filmmaking. I was completely locked out by that point.
But it didn't make the huge waves with audiences and critics that some of his earlier work made, even though After Hours is probably one of his best, if not his best film from the 80s. No, wait, we're not at that shot yet. Hold on, it's coming back, I promise. Scorsese has said he was really trying to get his footing together in the changing commercialized era of the 80s.
The key thing was, could I go back to the way I made pictures when I did Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, or even Taxi Driver, Taxi was 45 days and nights shooting. New York, Raging Bull, and King of Comedy were 100 days shooting. And there were big crews and lots of lights. And can I go back? And I had met Michael Ballhaus, who worked with Fassbinder, and we changed the whole way of working. So for me, it was really learning how to make pictures again and learning to shoot fast and a sense of freedom.
And he was really struggling to find that balance between personal work and commercial work. For instance, even with his more personal work, like The Last Temptation of Christ, he was struggling to cut through and find his connection with the audience that he had in the 70s. Last Temptation is a great film, but it wasn't looked at as great at the time. The 80s has to be Scorsese's worst era of filmmaking, not because he wasn't making good work. After Hours, The Last Temptation of Christ, The King of Comedy, they're all fantastic films. But he was struggling to find his connection with the audience in the ever-changing commercialization of American cinema. But then you have the 90s. In this era, Scorsese stuck out his chest and reminded the world exactly who the fuck he was. Scorsese not only found a way to have his unique style be at the forefront of his films, but found a way to make those films profitable at the same time. And in many ways, this era may have topped the 70s, opening with what many believe to be his best film.
As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster.
And remember when I said Scorsese took all that he had and put it into Raging Bull? Well, he did the exact same thing with Goodfellas, only this time he made it even more personal. Scorsese grew up in these neighborhoods. He saw this lifestyle happening all around him, even though he wasn't a part of it. Goodfellas and its spiritual sibling Mean Streets are almost like documentaries of the life in the neighborhoods that Scorsese grew up in. And speaking of which...
Summer's gone, and all the roses dark.
If you guessed Goodfellas, then you would be 1000% correct on these two shots mirroring each other. They not only mirror each other in terms of execution, but in terms of substance. Both see someone flaunting and stunting when they shouldn't be. Both allow the audience to come to the conclusion of what the character is thinking. However, for me, the version in Goodfellas is superior thanks to the quality and clarity of the visual storytelling. Scorsese's visual vocabulary is more refined here. Now, both of these shots use slow motion here, but the way it's used in Goodfellas is completely different. It's almost unnoticeably slow. Whereas the Mean Streets version was probably shot at 60 frames per second and shown at the standard 24 frames per second, the Goodfellas version was much more subtle, probably shot somewhere between 35 and 45 frames per second, then shown at 24. This is way less noticeable of slow motion by the audience, and it has a more subtle and psychological effect on the viewer. It's the difference between telling the audience what you want them to feel and making them feel what you want them to feel without them even noticing that you're doing it. Beyond that, Goodfellas is a sprawling gangster epic that uses innovative editing and voiceover work to dive into the criminal underworld, and best of all, it was profitable. It's as if the entire world woke up and remembered Scorsese's really good at this shit. But that was a modest success compared to what his next film would be. Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese have been friends since the 1970s, both of them being involved with the clique, the movie brats. Now, Steven Spielberg, at the time and to this day, is financially speaking the most successful filmmaker of all time. Knowing that, Spielberg said to his friend Scorsese, "One day I'm going to produce a film for you, and it's going to be the most profitable film that you ever put out." And true to his word, he did just that. That film was the remake of 1962's Cape Fear. But just because it was a remake doesn't mean Scorsese didn't put his own style on it. One of the ways he did that is by showing Max Cady actually in prison on the day that he's being released. What this does is it takes away some of the mystery from Max Cady, but also adds an extra layer of threat, showing his focus and determination as he does these dips in his prison cell. It makes him a real person, which in many ways makes it scarier than if he just popped up like in the original version. Not only was it by far commercially his most successful film, but it was a critical success too, proving that Scorsese could be both artistic and commercial in his work, which he further solidified with his film Casino. Now, to me, these two films best express Scorsese's growth as a filmmaker from when he started to the 1990s. In the 1990s, Scorsese's style of filmmaking got a little bit of polish to it. His directorial style got more confident and bolder, and at this point, no one could deny that he was a master. He went from being a great filmmaker to one of the greatest of all time during this era. Now, the late 90s saw a slight dip in his commercial viability, but the quality of the work and the exploration of his pillars of filmmaking stayed the same. Both Kundun and Bringing Out the Dead are often overlooked works in his filmography, but trust me, they're fantastic, and if you haven't seen them, you should definitely check them out. But the work that he did in the 90s gave him more freedom and proved that he can be financially successful, which allowed him to go on his actual commercial run while still making films that were personal and that interested him without bending over backwards to make studio films just to prove that he can make money.
Marty, rather than joining the establishment, has rather had the establishment join him. People go to Marty to make Marty's movies. Marty doesn't have to come begging to anybody. I mean, everybody wants to make movies with Marty. The studios like his films, love his films, as we all do, and they seek him out.
Every single film from this next decade, starting with Gangs of New York and ending with Shutter Island, nearly doubled and in some cases tripled their budget. And we're not talking small budgets here. We're talking close to $100 million budgets for each of these films, which Scorsese could now work with because of his amazing output in the 90s, combined with his newfound collaboration with Leonardo DiCaprio, who was at his box office height in the late 90s and early 2000s. Just so you really understand how successful this period was for Scorsese, listen to the numbers. Gangs of New York made $193 million on a $100 million budget. The Aviator made $214 million on a $110 million budget. The Departed made $291 million on a $90 million budget. Shutter Island made $295 million on an $80 million budget. But that's just that decade. His commercial run continues through his next two films. Now, Hugo was not technically a huge financial success, but it made back its production budget. But the one that really solidified Scorsese as a box office juggernaut is The Wolf of Wall Street, making it an eye-watering $406 million on a $100 million budget, which saw Scorsese taking similar notes from Goodfellas and Casino, updating them and making them hilarious. I remember seeing it in theaters and dying of laughter. I mean, this scene in particular had me bent over laughing. But it's an interesting one because it's not done like how many comedy scenes are. And what I mean by that is it's a very slowly paced scene. Cuts aren't snappy. There's no witty dialogue going a mile a minute. It's really just visual storytelling and Leonardo DiCaprio and his physical comedy skills. See, Scorsese was brilliant to just basically let the camera observe the brilliance of DiCaprio's physical comedy. And it goes to show you that there are a million ways to achieve an emotion from your audience. Sometimes going against the norms can be more effective than doing what is traditionally done in the style of scene that you're telling. For instance, this shot is almost a minute and a half with no cuts at all, but it's possibly the most funny scene in the entire film, which is filled with funny scenes. But traditional logic with comedic scenes would dictate that this scene shouldn't really work at all. Something has to break it up with either cutting or dialogue to make it funny. Something outrageous should happen, but Scorsese understands that in actuality, the scene within itself is outrageous and funny. And holding on it was the right choice. It's moments like this that make The Wolf of Wall Street so hilarious and make Scorsese a master. But Scorsese did something interesting after this film. You see, he pivoted from what would be the more commercial path to take. And instead he did a film that he'd been wanting to do for decades. Silence. Silence is almost the complete opposite of The Wolf of Wall Street. It's slowly paced, not very much room for comedy, and yet it works to help us understand Martin Scorsese better. You see, this is where we enter his final phase, or at least what I believe will be his final phase. Scorsese, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he has expressed understanding for Akira Kurosawa's lifetime acceptance speech at the Oscars when Kurosawa said,
"Because I don't feel that I understand cinema yet. Cinema is a marvelous thing, but to grasp its true essence is very, very difficult."
Scorsese has said he understands, but by the time that he understood, it was too late. Meaning, Scorsese is 80. Now, he could work for another 20 years or he could not. We don't know. But it showed him that there's a universe of understanding cinema that he hasn't even begun to reach. Now, mind you, I'm recording this directly after seeing Killers of the Flower Moon. And his last three films with Silence, The Irishman, and Killers of the Flower Moon all are extremely reflective and extremely empathetic. To an extent, all of Scorsese's films are personal, but these are personal in a completely different way. It's odd to say because Scorsese's films have always been mature, but it's another level of maturation within his filmography. These films are almost as if Scorsese's looking around at the world and understanding it in a different way. There's a melancholic beauty to each of them that I think Scorsese could not have done 40 years ago. It goes beyond just cinema to a place that I don't think many of us will understand until we're a lot older, but I think all of us can feel all the same. Scorsese is the master. He is considered by many, with cause, to be the greatest filmmaker of all time, and definitely the greatest living filmmaker. You could watch only Scorsese films for the rest of your life and have a wealth of knowledge on filmmaking and cinema as a whole. He has forever changed the art form and reshaped it in his own image. But I'm curious, what do you think his greatest era is? Is it finding his voice in the late 60s and early 70s? Is it the exploration of style for the rest of the 70s? Is it relearning cinema in the 80s? Is it solidifying himself as a master in the 90s? Is it his commercial era of the early 2000s? Or is it where he is now, a wise master passing his information along to the rest of us? Whatever your favorite era of Scorsese is, you can't deny that there are very few filmmakers who have had this impact on cinema for this long. To be honest, there are only two, him and Spielberg. We're talking 50 years of cinematic excellence. 50 years. And in it, we've seen some changes. But through it all, Scorsese has remained himself, and you can see the growth from the beginning to where he is now. He is truly the master.
Keep it up for me.